Hello and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. Hope everyone is doing well. Today I have 4 ghost stories from the Haunted Canada series. If I pronounce anything wrong, I do apologize. Stage fright, Edmonton, Alberta. As if the stress of performing live on stage in front of an audience of 145 people weren't enough to deal with, a ghost has been disturbing actors in the Waterdale Theatre for years. Stagehands say not a week goes by without some sort of paranormal activity being reported in the theatre. Most members of the theatre group try to ignore the unexplainable sights, sounds, and sensations, particularly during performances. But that's not always possible. Sometimes the ghost tries his best to stop the show from going on. One night, an actor was getting ready in the second-floor dressing room before taking the stage. No one else was with her. She slipped into her costume and applied makeup while going over her lines. She stood up and turned her back to the dressing table for just a moment, but that was enough time for the theater's ghost to act. The woman returned to the table only to discover her wig had been taken. A quick search of the dressing room turned up nothing. That's when panic set in. She needed the wig and was due on stage in 30 minutes. She ran around the theater, rounding up everyone who could help. They searched every square inch of the building. Finally, just moments before the curtain was set to rise, the wig was found on the main floor near a pile of stage props. Although the actor was relieved, no one could say how the wig had gotten there. The hair-raising experience is just one of the many times the ghost, nicknamed Walter, after the theater he haunts, has interfered with the show. It's believed that he's the spirit of a volunteer firefighter who died in 1909 while the building was being constructed. The building was originally home to the oldest fire hall in Alberta. The fire hall was in operation until 1954, when it became a furniture warehouse, followed by the Waterdale Theatre in 1974. Since that time, the theatre has become a major part of Edmonton's thriving arts and culture scene, despite Walter's presence. He's often seen floating through the theatre's halls, dressing rooms, and stairwell. He's fond of moving important props and costumes, like the runaway wig, when they're needed most. Lights flicker and cold spots envelope theatre goers. The piano occasionally plays itself, and people have heard the tower bell ring loudly without anyone near it. As if that wasn't enough, Walter is known to walk loudly throughout the building at inopportune times. Richard Hatfield, the theatre group's technical director, recalls a time that Walter tried his best to interrupt a show, along with a few other crew members. Hatfield was in the theater sound booth on the main floor. All was going well until they heard footfalls directly above their heads, loud enough that Hatfield feared the audience would be distracted by the noise. He immediately called the crew that were upstairs and told them to stop clomping around. Their response was unsettling, to say the least. No one on the second floor had moved in a long time. They'd all been still throughout the performance. In order to calm the crew and not create any fear, Hatfield brushed the phantom footfalls off and tried to convince the others that it might have been crew members on the main floor that they heard. But even as he said it, he knew it couldn't be true. The main floor was made of concrete, a surface that wouldn't produce the hollow thud, clomping thud clomp they heard, and everyone agreed the footfalls had definitely come from above. Distressingly, this wasn't an isolated incident. Hatfield has to work late from time to time and often alone, or so he would like to believe. Sometimes when the theater is dark and quiet, he suddenly hears the same heavy feet stomping across the floor above. He stops what he's doing and rushes upstairs to investigate. But all he ever finds is an empty room. The place is quiet, dead. Dead, maybe, but silent, not in the Waterdale Theatre. The Watcher in the Night, O'Leary, Prince Edward Island. On a clear day from the top of the West Point Lighthouse, you can see New Brunswick across the turbulent waters of the Northumberland Strait. At a height of 20.62 meters, it's the tallest lighthouse in the province. Amazingly, only 2 keepers tended the lighthouse's fire during the 88 years before it became electric in 1963. William Willie Anderson MacDonald, the first keeper from 1875 to 1925, and Benjamin McIsaac, who was keeper from 1925 to 1963. The lighthouse had to be lit each and every day, and it is said that Willie didn't miss a single one during his tenure. Not for sickness or vacation, not even death can keep him away. In 1984, the lighthouse was converted to include an inn, restaurant, and museum. For the first few years in operation, volunteers spent 2 nights a week in the lighthouse to give the manager time off. If there were no guests in the inn by 9 o'clock, the volunteer would lock the inn and go home. One summer evening, once the restaurant had closed and staff had gone home, Myrna Boltier, the volunteer on duty, waited patiently as the clock slowly ticked away the time. Finally, once it was 9 and not a soul was around, Myrna prepared to leave. She climbed the 72 stairs to the top of the lighthouse, making sure all was well. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and the only sound that accompanied her footsteps was the crashing of waves on the beach outside. After turning off the lights and locking the door behind her, Myrna got in her car. That's odd, she thought. There was a light coming from a bedroom above the lighthouse's veranda. That wasn't on a moment before. There was nothing to do but go back inside to investigate. She climbed the stairs and entered the lit room. It was still empty. No sounds, nothing stirring. With a final hesitant scan of the room, Myrna turned the light off and left the lighthouse once again. This time a little quicker. After locking the door and walking to her car, she couldn't resist stealing another glance over her shoulder. Myrna stopped dead. The light had been turned back on. There was no chance Myrna was going to risk her well-being by going back into the lighthouse alone that night. She left without hesitation, saying that whatever presence wanted the light that badly could keep it on. That wasn't the last time the light suggested that the living weren't the only people dwelling in the lighthouse. A few years later, a group of volunteers had been going over an architect's renovation plan before calling it a night. They had been instructed to turn off all the switches in the main control panel, except for the one that controlled the navigation light, before locking up. They ensured the building was empty, turned out the lights, and then shut off the power at the control panel. But just before they left, someone remembered the architect's drawings were still in the kitchen. Because the building was shrouded in darkness, the volunteer who went in needed a flashlight to see. After retrieving the drawings, the volunteer passed the flashlight beam over the kitchen for a final check. All was well, and hastened to rejoin the others. As they drove home, their car was stopped by a person who informed them that a distraught neighbor was missing. It was feared that this person might try to enter the lighthouse, climb to the top, and jump to his death. Although they had locked the door, they decided it would be best to return to the lighthouse and double-check that the man had not found a way in. Fortunately, the suicidal man was found elsewhere safe and sound. But how could the volunteers explain what they encountered back at the lighthouse after unlocking the door and stepping tentatively inside? They discovered that the kitchen light had been turned on. It made no sense. The control panel switches were still turned off, so the lights were receiving no power. There was only one explanation that anyone could fathom. Willie was in the building. In the years since these events, many guests have reported that the bedroom's lights turned on when no one else was around. With a laugh, staff reveal that it's just the ghost of Willie playing tricks with the light. Having served as keeper for 50 years, working the lights is in his flesh and blood, figuratively speaking, of course. The artist never dies. Victoria, British Columbia. Most of the staff at the James Bay Inn work with one eye on their task and one eye on the dark corners in each of the hotel's guest rooms. Camille, who admits that working alone in the hotel is very creepy, has experienced many scary events since she began working there as a housekeeper and at the front desk. One day she was meeting with her boss, Steve, in a small office. Steve left for a moment to get something, and Camille thought she was alone. She wasn't. The silver bell on the front desk outside the office suddenly rang. The ding was a familiar sound, alerting staff that a customer is waiting for service. But Camille could see the front desk. She could see the bell. No one was standing anywhere near it. Ding! The bell rang again. Camille left the office, scanned the front of the hotel to ensure there wasn't anyone hiding anywhere, and then examined the bell. There was no way it could ring on its own, but somehow it had. Camille felt that something was trying to get her attention, but the spirit's intent remained a mystery. The next time one of the hotel's ghosts tried to get her attention, its intentions were abundantly clear. A month after the bell rang, Camille and another employee, Jasmine, were cleaning the bar early in the morning before it was open. Once again, Camille thought she and her co-worker were alone. Once again, she was wrong. The two cleaned while listening to hip-hop on the radio. The music made the monotonous core a little more bearable, but suddenly the radio switched to a Christian rock station. With a shrug of the shoulders, Camille and Jasmine crossed the room and turned the radio back to the hip-hop station. They returned to their work, but the radio soon switched stations again, this time to jazz music. The two women exchanged a nervous glance. They were starting to get freaked out. They slowly approached the radio and changed back to the hip-hop station once more. And the radio immediately turned off. Dead silence filled the bar. Without a word, both Camille and Jasmine knew what to do. They ran. It's common knowledge there's a ghost haunting the hotel. A ghost that's eager to ensnare the souls of anyone who dares to criticize the artwork of Emily Carr, one of Canada's most famous painters. That's because the ghost is Carr herself, who died in the building in 1945. Locals and tourists who gather in the James Bay Inn's pub and restaurant enjoy lively discussions about Carr, an eccentric artist who painted forest landscapes and First Nations villages and imagery of the Pacific Northwest coast. But they're careful not to be too critical of her work. Those who knew better are fearful of Carr's curse. Say the wrong thing about one of her paintings and you might find yourself trapped in the James Bay Inn for an eternity. The hotel, which opened in 1911, had a brief interlude as a hospital run by Mother Cecilia's religious order from 1942 to 1945. It was during this time that Carr was admitted due to the health complications and spent her final days. She passed her time painting in the upstairs lobby and then took her art outside to sell on the street corner. She died in her room from a heart attack, one of many that she suffered late in her life. Shortly after the Priory turned back into a hotel, Carr's ghost began appearing in guests' bedrooms late at night. Startled customers have been awoken by televisions that have turned themselves on with the volume raised to ear-splitting levels. Others have received telephone calls without anyone on the other end and no record of incoming calls. Lights flicker and a gas fireplace on one of the upper floors turns itself on when it gets too cold. Even for the ghost, as active as she is in and around the guest rooms, Carr is most often seen in the pub and restaurant. That time Camille's hip-hop music kept changing, she believes Carr was to blame, that she didn't approve of Camille's music selection. Now, whenever Camille enters the bar area at night, she calls out, "Hi, Emily, it's just me." That doesn't stop Carr's ghost from scaring staff by opening doors and rattling the restaurant's dishes. She once reached out and grabbed a bartender's leg from behind, then squeezed him tightly, painfully, causing him to shout out and startle the other people in the bar. Perhaps she's upset with the new use of the bedroom, in which she passed away. During renovations, the room was converted into the men's bathroom. Guests often feel they've walked through the intense cold spot when they enter the bathroom, and then feel as if they're being watched while going about their business. Some say her ghost is so protective of her legacy that she'll not only turn on dissenters, but curse them to return to the hotel following their own deaths, forever trapping them in the haunted hotel with Carr herself. If you're not a fan of Carr's art, you'd better be careful when you stay in the James Bay Inn. The Doctor will see you now. Collingwood, Ontario. Have you ever entered an old building or room alone and immediately known that something bad had happened there? Your head starts to spin, your stomach suddenly drops, and your skin breaks out in a cold sweat. You feel as if you're not alone as you had thought, nor as you had hoped. That happened to 3 professional women in their mid-40s from Ottawa who shared a 3-bedroom suite in the Build House Country Inn and Spa in September 2014. As soon as they entered their room for the first time, 2 of the 3 friends felt a weird energy that they tried and failed to shake off. While they played board games and had a late afternoon snack, one of the friends kept seeing an odd presence in the hallway of their suite. They left the inn and ventured into town for the night, returning well after midnight and quickly settling into bed. 2 of the friends shared one of the bedrooms, but they weren't about to get any sleep. Things they recall with unease were about to get really weird. As soon as they lay down, they felt on edge, restless, anxious, uneasy, and unsettled. Waves of inexplicable nausea washed over them as if something in the air was making them ill. Then they started to hear things. It wasn't a bump in the night, more of a rattle and shake, and the sound was unnervingly relentless. They thought it might be passing trucks, but the sound never faded. Perhaps it was a rodent in the walls, but it wasn't a scurrying sound, and it was growing louder. At their wits' end, the friends scanned the room and finally located the source of the sound, a revelation that still sends shivers up their spines. Their attention was drawn to 2 porcelain plates on the wall at the head of the bed. Something was rattling them violently, as if the weird energy they had felt in the room was trying to shake the plates loose. They sat up in bed, scared and confused. One of the women shouted, "Take them down!" The other removed them from the wall and placed them on the bedside table, where the plates slowly and quietly stopped shaking. But the room didn't remain silent for long. They soon heard a muffled conversation, an unusual whispering, somehow coming from the air all around them, and the temperature plummeted to bone-chilling, teeth-chattering lows. When the sun finally rose the next morning, they hurried to leave without showering, and who can blame them? It was clear that one of the Build House's ghosts was to blame. Was it simply a bit of harmless fun, or do the spirits that occupy the turn-of-the-century home harbor a hidden malicious intent? Construction of the house began in 1909, but took 3 years. It was built for Dr. Joseph Robbins Arthur, who opened an office and consulting room in the north part of the home. He lived with his wife, daughter, and son in the living quarters, which faced south of the garden. Dr. Arthur chose the name Build for the Scottish word for shelter, and a grand shelter it was. The good doctor opened the home to transients passing through town during the Great Depression, giving them a hot meal and new clothing. The home also sheltered Dr. Arthur's father-in-law, Henry Robertson, in his latter years, as well as Dr. Arthur's daughter, Bethia, who also spent her final years on the third floor, where she had fond childhood memories of playing with the gymnastics rings her father had installed there. The question remains, who haunts the Bild house today? There are many theories. The prime suspect is Dr. Arthur himself, a fashionable dresser who some cleaning staff had reported seeing in the guest rooms. Two sisters-in-law from England, both mediums who can communicate with the dead, stayed in the inn one night and communicated with Dr. Arthur's spirit. They discovered that he was confused and didn't know where to go after he died. So he returned to his home. Perhaps he'll never find closure and will remain in the Bild house until the end of time. As innocent as his intentions may be, Dr. Arthur's sudden appearance in the night remains a haunting vision that terrifies people staying there. Even owner Bill Barclay, who regularly hears from guests who have experienced paranormal activity, has seen Dr. Arthur's ghost. He awoke once to see a man in a top hat standing under the archway of his bedroom. Once the ghost was spotted, he silently receded into shadows and was gone, leaving Barclay feeling very conflicted, to say the least. Although the doctor might be stuck in limbo, at least he has company. The English sister-in-law also identified a second spirit dwelling in the inn. Spending her afterlife with Dr. Arthur is Barclay's great-grandmother, a small but powerful woman who is following Dr. Arthur around to make sure he behaves. It's also believed that daughter Berthia is so fond of the Bild house's attic that she remains on the third floor walking around and waking guests from the sound of footsteps in the middle of the night. One guest was awoken by a creepier sound that made it difficult to fall back asleep, cackling laughter. If you faint at the sight of blood, you'll especially want to avoid the final ghost, who has been seen in the Bild house, known as Head Wound Lady. This disturbing apparition has been reported by many guests over the years. Returning from a long day and ready for a good night's sleep, people have been passed by a woman quickly running downstairs in blood-stained clothing. The blood on her clothes is gushing from a fresh cut on her head. Once the shock fades, the alarmed guests run to the front desk to report what they've seen. Employees search the building and check on the other guests, but no one is ever found to be injured. The bleeding ghost has disappeared. Some believe her to be the doctor's late wife. Whoever the ghost is, at least she's spending her afterlife in the same building as a man who might be able to tend to her wound. Spend a night in the Bild House Country Inn and Spa, and the doctor will see you, whether you want him to or not. Thank you for listening. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing and liking to my channel, and I will see you on the next one.